From the nation's capital, this is the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast with your host, Rob Snowhite.
My name is Rob Snowhite, and yes, that's my real last name. This is episode 261 of my podcast. My podcast, if this is the first time you're hearing it, it's about fly fishing education. There's interviews, and then there's me talking, and then there's some travel stories. Well, this episode features Paul Dixon and some absolutely amazing fly fishing stories. I first met Paul when I began working at the Ocean Reef Club's Grand Slam Outfitters in December of 1999. I rarely saw Paul as he was one of the most in-demand guides at the shop. I was only able to briefly interact with him in the mornings when he was meeting clients or at the end of the day when he was dropping clients off at the docks. This is my opportunity to share Paul's story with you. We're going to hear stories about Paul pioneering flats fishing in Montauk to guiding throughout the Florida Keys. This episode is absolutely full of amazing stories and the amazing people that Paul has gotten to know throughout his years in fly fishing. I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you're either in Montauk in the summers or in the Keys in the winter, please be sure to look up Paul. And last episode, we were in cold and snowy Wyoming. We're going to go down to cold front Florida right now. Captain Paul Dixon, where are you today?
I am sitting watching a cold front blow in at Sugarloaf Key right above Key West as we speak on my canal.
I will be down there in a couple of months for spring break, so I'm going to have to ask you off air some questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer.
Absolutely. All right, so how did a West Coast kid become an East Coast fly fishing guide in the Northeast and way down in Florida, / a TV personality and article author?
Oh, boy. Well, it's a long, circuitous route. You know, I grew up in Newport Beach in California, and my family went way back in fishing. My grandparents were big fishermen. They had started in the 20s and 30s and belonged to the Balboa Angling Club and all that. My dad and I spent, all our weekends and everything growing up on the half-day boats going out of Davies Locker and Newport and this and that. And when I was in high school, I worked at this tennis and ski shop down by the river jetty in Newport, and the guy ended up selling the ski shop. And he said, I bought a hunting and fishing camp in Idaho. Would you like to come work for me when you get out of high school? Which I was graduating that year. I was, I think, 16. So I said, of course. I loved, fishing. And, I thought, wow, this is so cool for a summer job. So I drove out to Idaho and I worked on the Wild Rose Ranch on Henry's Lake. And I did everything, but the interesting thing is that all these guys from the San Francisco Fly Fishing Casting Club would spend their summers there. And guys like Gil Day and Ed Landry and these are all the old timers that, fly fished in California and everything. And when I got there, they said, kid, we don't spin fish here, we fly fish. So they ended up teaching me to fly fish, and I just, loved it. And the lake was filled with these huge cutthroat trout that literally at times on damselfly hatches and stuff like that would boil like the bluefish do, in Montauk and stuff. But it was a great experience and everything. And then I spent the summer up there. When I got back and started, looking at colleges and everything else in Southern California, I was sort of addicted to the fly rod. So I tried it on the beaches there and in, Newport and Back Bay. I would take it to Mexico, in the early 70s. And, I just just tried to goof around and do the fly. It was tough to go trout fishing in Southern California. The closest place was like I'd drive up to Mammoth or something like that, or Owens Rivers, But I did it in saltwater because I lived right on the beach. And then after I got out of college and everything else, I had my business there. I sort of worked for a real estate company developing commercial real estate and such. And I got invited to a thing later on in London and met this girl that was from the Hamptons. And so to make it short, we started a long distance relationship. Eventually we got married. She came out and got her master's at USC. I'd met her when she was going to the London School of Economics. And so we spent a bunch of time in California. And eventually when we got married, she said, look, I'd really like to move back east. And by that time, I had gone back and forth. And her family lived on a place out in Long Island. And needless to say, once I saw it, I was blown away. Being a California guy, I had always heard that, New York was, industrial wasteland and, a decaying city. And, there was just nothing there. But when I came out and saw the east end of Long Island, I was blown away how, beautiful it was. And how wild, how you could go hunting or fishing right in your backyard. In California, I'd have to drive hours to do anything, especially in Southern California. So I was enthralled by it. And the thing that really, piqued my interest being a fly fisherman was that this was the land of the striped bass. And, this was the early 80s. And unfortunately, the striped bass had disappeared. And so, eventually we ended up moving back to the Hamptons, or actually I moved back to Connecticut first. And I sold my company. I decided to pursue my passion, and I wanted to get into fly fishing. So I ended up going and working at Orvis, New York. Went in one day and said, I just want a part-time job because I want to, find a lodge, or I had visions of a salmon camp, or I don't know, So I was looking for anything. On my honeymoon, I'd gone to Nova Scotia and then to Prince Edward Island to salmon fish. And I thought, wow, we almost found a place up there. And I thought, man, this would be great to have a camp. But then again, my wife said, what are we going to do in the winter? So anyway, I ended up working for Orvis for like 5 years, and I ran their fly fishing department. And in those years, it was going from, I don't know, the late 80s or whatever. The striper, there was a moratorium on it, and it came back. And by the time that I've, decided, actually, Orvis was the one that said, why don't you do something in the Hamptons since you're always out there? And that's where my wife's family had an estate there. And so we, thought, wow, that'd be pretty cool. And so I opened a store, and I got my guide's license, thinking that not so much about the guiding, but I just wanted to go fishing. And the only way I figured that my wife would let me go fishing was if I could, say, yeah, I got people to, go and everything else. So I got that, and things just sort of took off. The striper came back in the 90s. I started the store in 93. And, I'd fished for years and never caught a striper, caught a bunch of bluefish, but they started coming back, and we started seeing them in, different areas. In those days, I was fishing a lot on the beaches. I'd see them down in Shinnecock and, during the day. So we started plying the beaches, and lo and behold, they started coming back in force. And so by the time that I had my, it was very fortunate that my timing at the time with the striped bass comeback was just about right, because by the time we started the store in 1995, I think that the state declared that the striper was recovered, and it was. I mean, it was amazing what 10-year moratorium had done for the fish. And so we started guiding, and one of the things that we did is, the water was clear. The first time that I saw fish swimming around, I remember I was at Shinnecock, and I started seeing these fish inside during the day. And I had this old timer. One day I'm out there fly casting, and he comes up behind me, and he says, are you seeing them? And I said, yeah, I actually am. And he said, it's funny to see you out here because I used to be the best gigger of bass back in the day. And I guess back in the 50s and 60s, they used to spear them at night. They would wear a headlamp and they'd see them in the water and they'd actually gig them. So he said, I used to sit at this spot and gig stripers. And he said, but I was the best at it. I said, really? He said, yeah, because most guys did it at night. And I realized that they were here during the day and I'd sit out here in the day. So it's, I find it very interesting that you're sitting out here with your fly rod. And that was a big, clue that the stripers, ran the flats. And, I'd been told early on that they only were there at night, and you had to fish 60 feet of water and So we used to do a lot of fly fishing at night in the early days, figuring that's the only time that they're there. But when the fish came back, we realized that they didn't show on the surface like they did at night. They wouldn't come up so much and be hitting bait and everything else, but they'd come in with the tide and, whatever the spot you're at, they'd be there. So we ended up getting a flat skiff, myself and a couple other guys that were, thinking the same thing. John Applenap, who was actually, we become friends when my store first opened. His family owned Walker's Cay in the Bahamas. And we started fishing, around Gardiner's and Gardiner's Bay and everything else. And it basically all hell broke loose. It was just an unbelievable fishery and nobody had really seen it and done it. And so when we started, writing it, I got the magazines from working in New York. Everybody I knew, that, came out and did it. A lot of them were the writers for the, everything. All the publications were based in New York City. I knew everybody from working at Orbis, so they came out and saw this stuff, and it's sort of all of a sudden they started writing about it. I started writing about it. Bob Popovics came and filmed it with me, and then John Applenap and John invited Lefty and said, you got to come see this. We got Bob Popovics and Lefty and myself, and Jose Wahebi had turned into a big flats party, and Lefty had never seen it before. And when they came out, he was so blown away that he said, Paul, we got to do this again. Can we come next year? And so it turned into a, annual event back in the early 90s into 2000 where Lefty and, it grew to a huge thing. Peter Matheson and Jimmy Buffett came, John Cole, he's dead now. He wrote the book of the Tarpon, and Jeffrey Cardenas from Key West, and Jose Wahebi, and, Ed Jaworowski and Nick Curcione. And, we would all gather at, out in the Montauk, East Hampton, and we'd have this big flats party. And that's sort of how it all began. And then from there, the blitzes, and there you have it. The rest is history. So,
one thing I need to see before I die is all of those stripers coming up to the surface.
Yeah,
don't have that down here on the Potomac.
It's one of the things that Montauk is famous for, and I can remember the first day I ever saw it, and it was funny because in those days I was using my flat skiff. I had a LT20, Hughes LT20, which was a big flat skiff, but it was better for out there because of the rougher waters and, whatever. So anyway, I had a guy that, usually in early September, back by Gardiner's Island, we would start seeing albacore, and that's where we chased them, and, that's where they were. And so I had this guy that wanted albacore. And so we ran around Gardiner's and there was nothing. And I said, well, it's a nice day. Let's go over towards Fort Pond. They get in there sometimes. So we ran across to Fort Pond Bay and there was nothing in there. And I said, it's so nice. Let's just go look at the point. And so I went out to the point and turned the corner and, it was slick calm, and inside Turtle Cove was about 2 acres of bass frothing with the albacore on the outside of it. And I'll never forget it. I sat there and said, holy my God, look at this. And the guy I was with was like, oh, what are those things? And so anyway, those early days, at least the first month that was going on, I'd go and I'd have maybe 2 or 3 surf casters, no boats. At those days, all the boats went offshore, did the rips. There was no real light tackle fishery. And so I'd run back to East Hampton where I kept my boat, and then I'd run back out to Montauk and back and forth, and that went on. And finally I said, that's too much. I got to put my boat in Montauk. And John Applenap, whose father was a member over at the Lake Club in Montauk, said, you should just come out, and leave it out at the Lake Club, So there was the Sea Lion too, which is, made famous by Flip Hallett and the Walker's Cay Chronicles and everything, and my boat, and that was it. In those days, Montauk was empty because the striped bass had disappeared. Then there was no fishery. There was a lot of commercial boats, and there were some recreational anglers and stuff, but nobody really had caught on that the striper had come back, and they had, but not the inshore fishery. The surf casters did. In those days, the guys that hit the surf and the blitzes and stuff. And it turned actually, the more that my business grew, I ended up buying more boats and training more guides. Everybody that came to my store and wanted to do to work for us ended up always wanting to be a guide. So they'd either buy a boat or those days I bought, I think, 3 more or whatever. And so we just started training guides and it sort of turned into what it is today, where there's actually hundreds of boats. But it's interesting because you don't see, now you see Montauk, you can't even get a slip, and all the boat sales and everything's filled, and the striper, was the comeback, was the thing that generated all that. So it's interesting.
What is it about Montauk that brings so much fish there?
Well, I think that, for the striper and for a lot of, years and everything else, you see these ups and downs of different baits and stuff. The Menhaden, which was the bunker and everything else, had disappeared, years back, from overfishing, once again. So the thing that made the blitzes of Montauk a real thing was the rain bait, which is the bay anchovy. And the bay anchovy was huge, huge masses of it would come out of the bays. And the same thing with the stripers. The stripers that are in the blitzes are the fish that basically live inside the estuaries, the smaller fish. And when I say smaller, I'm saying usually in those days below 40 inches. You'd have a lot of fish that were, legal size 20, 28, But in those days, in the early days, the size limit was 36 inches. And but you rarely saw the big fish, would sort of go and, the deep rips and everything else. But anything below 40 inches, they live on the, back in the estuaries and sort of along the coast and everything else. The 50 pounders and stuff, at least for us, I didn't have any on flats or, in the blitzes. Occasionally, you'd get the surf cast, you get a big nor'easter or something, and it would blow some big bait in, you get some big fish. But, I would say 90% of the fish on the blitzes were basically the same fish that we would see on the flats and the younger year classes. Like I said, in those days, you had more fish that were, once they lowered the size limit from 36 to 28 inches, it sort of changed the dynamic, So anyway, so the rain bait is the main thing in Montauk, and every fish that migrated down the coast would stop there, and the rain bait would hold them because there was, massive, massive schools of it that would surround the point, on both the north and the south side and back into the bays. So it sticks so far out in the Atlantic, so everything that's coming out of Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Rhode Island, everything else has to pass Montauk. And when it finds the bait that's so thick, it stays there. It's like, it's like a rest stop on the highway between nowhere and nowhere that, everything stopped. And so it built, In the early days, it used to start sometimes in late August, and then it would go till November. And then you had another herring run after that. That's where, in those days, we would see the big fishes during the herring run. And that was usually around Thanksgiving into Christmas and December. That doesn't happen anymore. The fish have changed their patterns. So but it's the bait that makes Montauk and how they have to pass it. It's like it sticks so far out in the Atlantic that everything up and down the coast has to go by that way. So if you hold a bunch of bait, it's the rest stop and they all come.
When did you start migrating along with those fish down to the south to
Oh
Key
boy.
Largo?
So how that happened was, and weirdly enough, it was just, I think I want to say in 96 or somewhere in there, John Applenapp and his father and I, they were filming the Walker's Cay Chronicles, and they wanted to, they were sort of changing it up and everything. So they wanted to do a show. So we were actually, I think I was with Flip or something on the Sea Lion 2. I got a call from this guy at the Ocean Reef Club, Bruce Miller. And he had guided down there for years. He was a photographer, and he was starting an Orvis store at the Ocean Reef Club. And he said, look, I've heard so much about you and your clientele. I hear you've got this unbelievable clientele in the Northeast. And the Ocean Reef, is a very interesting place because it was started as a fishing club way back in the, I want to say 40s or whatever. And it was a family's fishing camp, and they had 1,000 acres up, and sitting at the tip of Key Largo. And it turned into this, fishing lodge, camp, to whatever. And then eventually, they sold places and it grew into this, this club. And basically it's a club that sits in Biscayne National Park. So I had been there in the early 70s with a friend of mine, and his uncle lived there. And I thought, wow, look at this. So anyway, so this guy calls and says, hey, would you be interested in coming down here and guiding? And I'd been to the Keys a few times and loved it. And, bone fishing was like something that just blew my mind. I wanted to do more of it because it also was sight fishing. So I came down and met with Bruce, and I figured, well, it beat shovel and snow in the winter. And so I started working at the Ocean Reef, and I would leave usually in December and come down to Florida. And I worked there for, God, I don't know how many years, and sort of learned the waters. At first I didn't know anything, but I just started running around and sort of try to figure it out. And that's where I started down here. And then years later, I sort of went on my own. I still, have a lot of clients at the reef and everything, but I really wanted to see other stuff. If you're at the Ocean Reef, I had Biscayne Bay down. It was unreal, but I kept my boat there. And I wanted to fish the Everglades, and I wanted to do some stuff, and I wanted a trailer, and so I ended up, I think after 15 years at the Ocean Reef, started doing it on my own. So I moved to Key Largo, or I stayed in Key Largo where I'd always been, but I started going a lot more time in the Everglades and Isla Morada and fishing. I was lucky enough when I first opened my store to meet a guy named Gordy Hill. And he was my first client, left a note on the floor, on the door, wanting fly tying material. And Gordy is a very interesting guy because he grew up in Long Island, and his grandfather and his father were big fly fishermen. And Gordy is now 90 years old. And so, like Lefty, if you look at Lefty's books, he has Gordy Pop Hill Flies, which is Gordy's father, that way back in the 30s and everything. So Gordy had fly fished, and he was he was a doctor, lived in Fort Lauderdale, and he bought a house in the Big Pine Key in, I think, 1958 or something, or 62, somewhere in there. So we became friends, and Gordy turned around and said, look, I'm blown away that there's stripers on the flats up here, and I want to come up and fish a few days with you each year and do this. I'm so surprised we never thought of it. We always did it at night. And so Gordy started joining me on the things with Lefty, and we invited him on all those early trips, and he said, you need to come down and fish with me in Big Pine. And so that's how I got to the lower Keys. I started fishing 20 something years ago with Gordy and John Applenapp and Jeffrey Cardenas, and we'd go out to the Marquesa Keys, and it was sort of a Renaissance time, at least for me. And so I was fortunate enough to learn a lot, of the Keys and this area from Gordy. And he's still around. He's unbelievable. He holds the world record all time for bonefish. He's fished everywhere around the world, and he's just a fountain of information. So, I owe a lot to, knowing the lower Keys and just, learning about this down here of all my time I spent with Gordy.
Are there a lot of similarities in the gear and tactics between Montauk and then when you're either on the Everglades side or the Atlantic side in Biscayne Bay?
Yeah, what I find really interesting and what's really helped my fishing, is that it's the crossover. And I'll give you a couple of examples. When you're sight fishing fish, which is my favorite thing to do, I don't care what it is, and that's why the striper was, it's like, wow, these things, you could see these just like bonefish. That was, was a revelation to most people, But it's about feeding the fish, and by coming down here and then going back there, I learned things here and took stuff back there that, as an example, Gordy actually showed me this fly, and he said, this is my cobia fly. I throw it at cobia when they're chasing rays and stuff down here. And I thought, man, that looks like a little lobster type thing. It was a splayed tail with, sort of a rusty orange with squirrel hackle on it. And I thought, man, but it had eyes and, it let eyes, so it would go down. And I thought, God, I bet the stripers would just love this. So I took it up north, and they just crushed it, and I thought, wow, that's really cool. And there was another fly. I caught a huge my biggest permit when I was training Amanda Switzer to pole, when she was coming to work for me. And I had this fly that was just unbelievable. Caught permit, caught bonefish, did everything, And so I took it up north, and the same thing. The stripers just crushed it. And so one day I'm sitting in my boat, and this guy's getting out of the boat after we'd just been out, and it was a cloudy, sort of shitty day. And so we ended up, blind casting and going for bluefish. And so when we get in, he looks down at my sight fishing rod, and he says, "What's that fly?" And I said, that's killer. He said, I would never put that in because it looked like a bonefish fly. And he said, I'd never use that on stripers. I said, dude, this thing, you see it in the water, and it's just, I said, watch. I said, just look at this thing in the water. We're standing in my skiff next to all these docks at the East Hampton Point. And I take the leader. I said, let's see how the fly moves. And this 40-inch bass comes racing out from underneath the dock, grabs the fly, takes off and runs screaming through all the boats in the docks. The guy is like, oh my God, do you got any more of those? So a lot of the back and forth, with techniques and flies and everything else, it's been really interesting because how you can apply stuff to stripers that you can apply to bonefish. Here's another example. The guys down here now are using the double overhand strip, because for tarpon and for the worm fly, it's, if you want a worm fly to move right, they motorboat through the water. It's not, you can't strip it like you do, like strip, one-handed. So the double overhanded strip, which is from the Northeast, is now the go-to tarpon, strip down here. And I've got, it's funny because, Andy Mill wrote an article about it, and a couple of guides got, really bummed at him for giving away the double overhanded strip. And I said, Andy, I'm going to send you a video that I shot with Bob Popovics, and I think 97 or something like that. And we're using a stripping basket, double overhand strip, because that's how Lance and Bobby fished the beaches up north. And we just used a rabbit strip fly, and it worked. It was deadly. My largest tarpon I ever landed on the ocean was with Lance Irwin.
How big
And
was
he
that?
was probably 160, 70 pounds.
That's me.
Yeah. So, and Bobby filmed the whole thing, and it's a double overhand strip into a stripping basket. I said, Andy, go shoot, because it's only been within the last, 6, 7 years that this double overhand strip down here has become the go-to, and it's because of the worm and how it swims. And then, and now it's deadly on tarpon, it's deadly. But that's one of those things that came out of the Northeast where you start sharing stuff that, the same thing. That's sort of the fun of the sport. To me, the thing that I like most about the whole sport is figuring it out. As I tell my people, that's the, it's the fun is, at least for me as a guide, is trying to figure out the fish, where he's going to be, what the tide, this, that, and everything else. But, as I tell the people, the best thing you can learn is the body language of the fish. And that's what the sight fishing has taught me a lot about how fish feed, and how when I'm blind casting, I watch guys blind cast and they just strip, and it's like, that you need to change that, because when you realize how fish react, and when you can actually see it, and how they, their body language tells, what it is, and how they, do things. It's like I watch these guys strip up north, and they'll just keep strip all the way back to the boat. And when you see it, I'll tell everybody, you have to pause. And when I first learned to fly fish, way back when in saltwater, guys, you never pause anything, because nothing, if you're being chased, you don't stop. And it's not true. The pause, especially on tarpon, especially on bass, that pause is where they come up right behind it and look at it and inhale it. A lot of times if you just keep stripping, they follow. And it's almost like a trout. They don't want to expend the energy, until they get a chance. A trout's not going to go 40 feet across the river. He's going to take whatever bug, comes through his window. So a striper and a lot of fish, they got to feel they can get it. So that's the stuff that I like, is what you can learn on the flat, seeing the fish, and how you can apply it to other situations and fishing conditions where you can't see them.
What are some other things you see out on the flats that person that works in an office all day would never see?
Boy, that's a good question. Just the thing. It's like when I first started, doing the like bonefish and the stuff here. I remember as a little kid and everything else, and this family in Newport, had this house, a beautiful, new house, but they built this huge saltwater aquarium in it. And in those days, that was really unheard of. You'd have aquariums, but not saltwater ones. And I was enthralled by it, from the amoebas and sea fans and the tropical fish. And once you see like the flats, even the flats up north and everything, once you see what happens, and you can really get a view, it's like I was pulling up north recently, and I'd see a sea robin fighting a crab. And it's just like, wow, look at that. That's pretty cool. And down here, it's the same thing. You see it. It's such a visual experience, and that's why I think people like the sight fishing. That's why the business up north has grown so much. I don't have any days available for sight fishing now, because, it's such a visual game. It's hard. It's technical, and it's gotten harder because the fish, once again, unfortunately, the striper is going the other way because of overfishing. So I find myself now, I have to run further, try to catch tides, and do a lot of different things because the flats themselves have changed. But just the the things that a guy sitting in his office that, doesn't see. It's just the beauty of being out there. You just don't know what you're going to run into. All of a sudden you see, I was fishing, as an example, I was pulling the flats of Gardeners one day, and as I was coming out of the harbor with the guy says, I tell him it's not the best flats time right now for stripers because it's August, the water's hot, and da da da. And he says, well, usually, my big thing is I like tarpon. I fish tarpon. Well, an hour later, we're pulling a white flat in Gardeners, and here comes an 80-pound tarpon down the flat. And the guys, we sat with that fish. It went back and forth for, I don't know, maybe an hour. Amanda, was around the corner, whatever. I called her and said, you got to come over and look at this, But it was this white long strip, and the thing, I don't know, he was lost, and he went down the strip. He turned around and come back like, well, I recognize white sand. It's, but every year you see, different things. They catch every year in Sag Harbor. A guy that has a pound net there gets 6 or 7 tarpon every year. 2 years ago, the guy in Shinnecock, a netter, got 2 bonefish. So it's interesting what you never know what you're going to run into. I've had sharks on the flats. I've had, it's just, that's the beauty of the sight fishing is, there's always stuff.
Do you get the opposite? Would there be a northern species fish that you would find in the Keys and you'd be very surprised?
Well, I think most people down here don't expect to see bluefish, but they're here. They're not the size they have in the, up north. But last year I found all these birds and I'm thinking, oh, look at this, and we get into, this is by Key West, and it's like, oh, these got jacks. Yeah. And then you start catching bluefish. It's like, you're kidding me. So, that's surprising, and the striper goes all the way, I think, down to the St. Johns River in northern Florida. There's a population of them there. So, there's some interesting stuff, but I think fish travel a lot more than people really think. And you're seeing a lot of it is, I don't know about, with climate change and everything else. Look what's happening. You're seeing a lot of the blackfish move up further north than they've ever been. They're, finding a lot of, different species are changing patterns and things are changing. So, it's, I think that you find it's like a tarpon that they tag here in the west coast of Florida, and they found it 200 miles from the Titanic, that followed the Gulf Stream up, so, I think that what I find really cool is like organizations like, the Bonefish Tarpon Trust and some of the studies that they're doing and what you find out about these fish, that the travel patterns and how they, they actually are a lot more expansive than we ever thought. It's interesting, The Keys, for example, they had a bonefish population that was plummeting after the 2010 freeze, and they couldn't figure it out. But through the research, they found out that they were netting in Cuba, and once they went into, this is another thing the Bonefish Tarpon Trust did is they went and talked to the Cuban government, said you should, you've got this whole industry at your doorstep, you need to quit netting the fish. Did that about 6-7 years ago, and now the Keys are starting to see all these small bonefish again. That and the hurricane, the hurricanes blow in all the, that's why you get golf courses down here that have tarpon in them. It's because they get blown in on these hurricanes. Last year, I think 2 years ago I think it was Dorian. And last year, I've never seen so many baby tarpon on the beaches in Key Largo, because of the hurricane blows in their little, the little baby, what they call, I think it's Lephosaurus, or which are like little. Yeah, and they're the eels. They look like a clear eel, and so that's why you find the tarpon way back, and and they find that after hurricanes that it replenishes. Same thing with the spiny lobster is not a breeding in Florida. Its eggs are blown here from the Bahamas and from the Caribbean. The same thing with a lot of the stuff here. And they've never found spawning bonefish here. So they think that a lot of it is, that's why all these ecosystems are all linked, It's the same thing with up north. If you take the Menhaden out of the Chesapeake and they got nothing to eat, then it's just that everything's so linked together in all these ecosystems that God knows how one can affect the other. So, but that's why it's the science and stuff that you're protecting some of these systems and everything is so important now.
Do the golf course owners let you fish those ponds in the Keys?
There's not. It's not in the Keys. There's no golf courses in the Keys, but in mid Florida, I mean, there is. I mean, there's one over in Key West and everything else. But
I think there's one near where we're staying. We're staying in Newtown.
Yeah, well, there's a few ponds and there's stuff. I mean, right down the street from me, these houses got inundated, and there's some lakes back in there that and that's how these fish get pushed in. It's the same thing with. I used to years ago fish this place that Tim Borski found, and Tim would say, okay, I'm going to show you this. And we'd go over, and it wasn't that far from Isla Mirada, but it was it looked like an island, but in the middle of this island that nobody could see, and Tim found it, I think on God knows Google Earth, was a pond. So we'd take the skiff, and then he'd make sure nobody was there, and he had the mangroves sort of propped up there, and he'd pull these mangroves that he had for this entrance, and we'd drag this canoe through, and then he'd stick the mangroves in the entrance, and we'd walk back into this pond, and the pond had a school of permit, it had redfish, it had a sawfish. It had, it was but it was totally enclosed, and those fish were blown in there years ago by some other storm, because it was landlocked.
When I worked with you at Ocean Reef, there was a barracuda that had been washed into the I guess pond on the property, and there was $100 for any kid that could catch it, and kids were coming in every day asking questions about catching this barracuda. They tried hot dogs and Klausers, and nobody could catch it.
It's crazy. It's just, all this, how these fish get distributed and how everybody, hurricanes are terrible things, but it's almost nature's way of replenishing and distributing, things. It's interesting how it all works.
And you work in two very storm prone areas. You've got the hurricanes in the Keys, and then you got northeasters and hurricanes in New England. How does that change the fishing? Does it take time to recover, or can you go in there the next season and start catching fish?
Well, it depends, and sometimes it takes, right after I fished the Cuda Bowl, which is a big tournament down in Key West, started by friends of mine, Justin Ray and Lauren Ray, and a group down here. And after the Cuda Bowl 2 years ago, after the hurricane, boy, you could really see the damage and the structurally and the mangrove damage. With the if the spray salt will kill the mangroves. So huge dead mangroves and and the palm trees and everything else. But it actually recovers pretty quickly. And it, I almost think in a lot of ways it's a cleansing in a way with the weather. The nor'easters up north are, they can be tough, and we had Sandy, and there's some, it's not great. For a guide, the weather is your, nemesis in a way, but it's also, you look at it, as I tell the young guides now, it's like weather's your day off. That's why if you're trying to make a living at this, you can say, I want my weekends off and I'm going to do that and everything. But if your weather, is bad 3 days before the weekend, and then the weekend you got off, that's 5 days. So basically as a guide, I book every single day, and the weather is your days off, at least in season, so the weather you're always playing, because it can, and you'll see it through the years. It may average out. I look at my old records and everything, but 1 year you lose 40 days to weather, because all of a sudden for 2 weeks, or whatever, it's like this year, we're getting cold snaps. Last year, there was only one little snap in January. That's why last year, the tarpon fishing down here, was insane. It was great. So the same thing with the permit. early season, the February, March stuff, So, it's just sort of, you got to play the weather as it comes. That's the nature of the business, but it can affect it in different ways.
What's a good weather pattern for you?
Well, here, you want warm and warm water temperatures, and it can turn on when, like, after a snap like this, and you get a real nice warming trend, where all of a sudden it goes from, it's the clouds are still going through today, but it's supposed to be down in the 40s, so it's going to shock the water. And I'm pretty far south, so it may not be as brutal as it is up in, let's say, 100 miles north in Key Largo and stuff, but it'll basically drives the fish out. The guys down here, that's where you spend your time barracuda fishing. Basically on these warm-up trends, like yesterday would have been perfect, except the clouds came in, but it had gone from 70-degree water temperature. And this last cold snap wasn't that bad, but then it goes up to 80. And when you get close to that 77, 78, 80 degrees, then you're tarpon fishing and they come in. The permit come back on the flats, the bonefish come back, and it's good to have that. It's the same thing in the fall. After a hot summer, the fish aren't on the flats during the day down here in the summer so much, because if it's 100 degrees and the flats are registering 100 degrees, on the water temperature, or 90, they don't like it. They only come in the early morning and the late evening to maybe feed around. But then when you get into the fall, then your weather changes and it cools down. Then the fishing can be really good. They had some excellent fishing down here in that, October, November stuff, September, October, November, their fall. Same thing in the spring. You go through a cold winter, it starts, and that weather pattern, the cold fronts are the same thing. It's like a short window of a seasonal change. So it gives the fish a chance to come back on the flats as it warms up. They're hungry. They're looking to feed. So oftentimes, you got to put up with the bad weather for a few days, but when it recovers, that's when the fishing is great.
So with all this nice weather, how do you protect yourself from the sun, and what sunglasses are your preference for spotting fish on the flats?
Well, I put on 50 sunscreen every day in front of a mirror, like it's shaving cream. And so I don't put it around my eyes. I don't put it, I go very lightly in case I sweat above my forehead, but I literally, it's like I'm wearing a mask, and I'm also wearing a mask, so, I'm trying as much as I can. And let me tell you, after years of doing this, you wouldn't think so. But anyway, so yeah, I'm in front of a mirror applying sunscreen. I don't wait to get on the boat, and I don't rub it. I can't get it in your eyes. I see guys, on the boat, and they just rub their hands together and lather their face. And then 20 minutes later, they're like, wow, my eyes are really, So that's the main thing with sunscreen. So that's why I do it in front of a mirror religiously. And then my favorite glasses are, bar none, Costas. They have such a variety of sizes, lenses, and their technology is so good. The polarization process has come, leaps and bounds. And I just love their glasses. It's just, they work great. If somebody, all the time I get people, I'll see their lenses, on the flats fishing, and 99% of my fishing is some sort of sight fishing or so. So I'm wearing a brown or a copper lens. A lot of people show up down here and they'll have a blue or a gray lens, and it doesn't show contrast as well. So Costa, to me, has the widest variety, the best frames and lenses, that you can build any combination. They're all the sunglasses now are expensive because of process and everything else. But I'm a firm believer in, buy the best that you can afford and hold on to them. Make sure you got croakies. You're not going to lose them and everything else. But going and buying the Flying Fisherman $15 sunglass is a waste, so Costa's is the one that I like because of how, you can send them back. They're great people. They're doing the right thing for the environment. They've got some great, plastic and reclamation and conservation, movements as a company that they've done. So in my book, they're the best.
That's what I wear. That's what I'll be wearing when I go to the Keys.
Well, there you go. See, Rob?
Do you even own winter clothes?
Do I own? Yes, because boy, I'll tell you what, there's nothing worse. I've had a couple of experiences down here where, it's like, holy moly, it got cold, and, you find yourself running, and you got to run up a ways, and, now the temperature is down, and you don't realize it until, you're running in a boat, and it's like, wow, I need my polar fleece. So yeah, I always come prepared. And my thing is, I didn't go to the Somerset fishing show this year. I missed it for the first time since it started. But I had to be in California. But I going back and forth between that. I used to fly up with Andy Mill, and it's like, dude, I'd look at Andy and it's like, Andy, I hope you brought some besides that flimsy. He's I'll be fine. It's like, okay. And then you get up to New York and it's, 10 below and it snowed too, he's like, oh my God.
Yeah, there was a kid from the Bahamas who had never seen snow one year at Somerset, and he was freaking out with all the layers he was wearing.
Yeah,
it was pretty funny.
It's a little shocking when you haven't been there.
How long does it take for you to get from Long Island to the Keys?
Well, where I'm at now, about 27 hours. I do it in 2 days. I drive 16 the first day, try to get to the border of Georgia or right in Georgia. It's a slog, but I time it. The whole secret of the drive is timing. So I'll leave on a Sunday at midnight, and I can get by, let's say I'm coming down, and I can get by New York and Washington, D.C. and all that traffic stuff that I'll run into. Then it's pretty smooth sailing. But coming back, I'm going to come on the weekends because New York City, I don't care if you're there at 5 in the morning. If you're during the weekday, you're going to hit traffic. But on the weekends, it's not. So I'll try to hit New York coming back on a weekend early morning, and I can usually make it home. But it's a slog. But I've been doing it for, 25 years. So
that's how I met Ralph.
Yep.
He was driving down and stopped in the shop to put out some flyers.
Yeah, that's funny. Old Ralph, he's running, he contacted me. He was running one of the windmill boats off of Montauk, where they're putting the windmills there.
Oh, wow.
And he's running one of the exploration boats that's out there doing the work.
I could do a podcast just on stories of staying in his apartment with him.
Oh my God. You don't have to tell me.
Craziest stuff I've ever seen or experienced. It
Yeah.
was like a reality TV show.
We could write a book about Ralph.
Yeah.
He's an interesting character.
Those were some fun days. Do you ever get starstruck with clients?
Not really. I've had, there's certain clients that you're excited to fish with because they share the sport, and that's sort of fun, that's the thing. But, what it comes down to, Rob, is that the age-old saying everybody puts their pants on the same way is sort of true, and I think that once they realize, because I fish with some very high-powered business people too, that are CEO and chairman of corporations that are used to, sort of being in control. And so sometimes there's that because, when I'm a type A personality, they're a type A, I do it, but they recognize that, that you are good at what you do. And that they, they respect that. Like, this isn't, I may know IBM or whatever the company, but, fishing, this is the guy. So you develop these bonds and friendships, and that's, I think the most fun of the whole thing is the friendships that I've made and the people over the years. And that's one of the the great things about the sport is it brings all types together, and it's fabulous fishing. I've gotten to know Jimmy Buffett and Roger Waters and all these people that, the heads of corporations. And, we're doing this BTT dinner with Tom Brokaw. I've known Tom for 30 years now. And
He
from my
stole
days,
my beer when I met him. Like literally took my beer and put it in his pocket.
That's funny. The Tom used to come into Orvis. He would go fishing out west, and these days he was on the nightly news every night. But he'd come back from fishing in the west, and his brother was out there, and Tom McGuane. They were friends and everything else, and so Tom would come back, and his brother had made this, what they now call granola. And Tom would, bring it in, and he'd say, my brother, and it had cranberries in it, or, whatever, all this. He's like, my brother, I don't know what this is, Paul, but you got it. So, and then he'd come in and talk for, an hour or something, because, I think when he went back to the newsroom, nobody really fly fished, and, he wanted to tell his fishing stories and still, relate. But that's how I got to know, Tom Brokaw really well, was that he just used to come in and loved to shoot the shit about fly fishing.
That's very cool.
Yeah. So, and he remains a good friend. He's helped us a lot. He did my first, BTT years ago. About 10 years ago. That was sort of one of the interesting things at the Ocean Reef, though, going back. When I first arrived down there, the Bonefish Tarpon Trust, in those days, was called Bonefish Tarpon Unlimited. And it was all these guys, Billy Pate and Stu Apt and George Hummel, and all the people at the Ocean Reef tried to get together to do something, because everything was, the environment was in trouble, and the flats and, the stuff that was going on. So they started this organization to try to put science and, get some stuff so they could, have some ammunition to go fight this, to let's find out about these fish and let's find out about this environment. So that's how it started. So the early days, I was a guide. They were just starting the tagging programs, and that's how I met, the Billy Pates and Stu Apps and, all these guys that really, down here at that time were legends, Sandy Moret and, Steve Huff and, and everybody. So through that, tagging program, and 25 years later now, BTT has learned all this stuff. So they asked me to do this dinner about 10 years ago. And I thought, man, who could I get? I don't know. And, it was sort of, and I thought, well, if I can get the entertainment, the dinner would probably, come together. So I went to Tom Brokaw, and luckily, I was good buddies with Lefty, and they just started filming Buccaneer and Bones, and so they'd become friends. And I asked them if they would be willing to do a dinner up in New York City. And they said, sure, let's do it. So they put it together. We all put it together, and I got a bunch of friends, from the Anglers Club in New York, and from, John Fisher from Urban Angler, and Rick Bannerow Anglers Club, John Apple, and we all put this, this thing together. Now, 10 years later, it's their biggest fundraiser. And Tom is doing it to get the Lefty Cray Award this year with, and all the people involved. But it's just, and it's amazing to see how the businessman, and this has been going on for 100 years, that, the business people traveling back and forth to the Keys, so it's sort of the gentleman angler and everything else, they always shared this passion, for the sport and everything. But, you couldn't live it. You had to make your living in New York City. And some of these guys have become, heads of the, old customers of mine that, started out at one of the financial firms and is now the chairman. It's and a lot of it, but it's funny how they also share that passion and came down to the Keys, for eons. So now that's the biggest fundraiser for the Bonefish Tarpon Trust is in New York City.
Have you ever thought about putting all these stories with people and events, writing a book about your time in fly fishing?
Yes, I've been asked numerous times, and I'm actually, trying to finish the thing. And when I get off the phone with you, Ian Davis, who's Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, has been asked to do the Bonefish book, which is like Andy's, Tom Piro's publishing it. It's like Andy's passion for tarpon. And so Ian's doing that. So they asked me to write a chapter. But yes, I weirdly enough, years back, I got asked by Judith Regan, who was a big sort of controversial publisher in New York City. I think she was doing the OJ book or something, but she approached me but they wanted stories about my clients. Tell us the scoop and everything. And I just wasn't into that. I've been asked many times for the fishing books, like they do something on stripers, but it seemed to me, and, everybody tells me I'm wrong, but it's been done so many times. So, it's, I think that Richard, what's his name? I did a thing for his book, where it wrote on the back cover, which is like the Striper Bible. I forget his name, but it's like the same publisher, Tom Piro, did Andy's book, and I think Richard did the one on stripers, but it's like an encyclopedia. It's so yeah. The more I think about it, the more I want to write something, but you always figure, I'll do that when I.
When the time arrives, and there's never time.
And all of a sudden, here you are.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
right.
So
I'm going to ask you some random questions now so we can wrap things up a bit. Do you have any irrational phobias?
No, not that I can think of. It's spiders. No. I'm not a big spider fan, but phobias besides, not really.
Mike Sfacchianos showed me that they're scorpions in the Keys, and I don't like scorpions.
Yes.
So I told my wife, I'm going to bring my my Solares UV light with me, and then I'm going to use that at night when I'm walking around to light them up because they glow under UV.
That's right.
What's the strangest thing you found while fishing?
Boy, strangest thing I found by fishing. Well, I'll tell you a sort of funny story, though. It's not that I didn't find it, but, I was. So one day I'm pulling down the Keys, and I got this client or whatever, and I got a boat behind me and a boat behind him. We're pulling the shoreline, and there's space between us, but, so we're doing this beautiful day, and it's up by Elliott Key, which is above the Ocean Reef. So I'm pulling down, and we go along, and here's this box sitting there, floating in the water, and then pulling, and the guy says, "Wow, look at that box there. I wonder what's in that." I said, "I don't know." He goes, "Maybe we should check it out." He said, "Look, I got guys behind me, and I want to find these fish with this tide is right in these little coves, And they said, "Let's just leave it." So we go pulling by. So the guy behind me is Bruce Miller. And so same thing. About 20 minutes later, he pulls by this box floating by and keeps on going and everything else. And his guy says the same thing. And then the guy behind him, as it comes to turn out, the guy calls Bruce that night and says, "Hey, Bruce, did you see that box going by?" And he goes, "Yeah. He said, "Yeah, we saw it. We decided, why? Did you pick it up?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, what was it, drugs?" He said, "No, man, it was $25,000 cash."
What?
So,
oh my gosh.
So anyway, but that's, I've had friends that, I've seen in the Bahamas, I've seen floating bales, waterlogged bales.
Square groupers.
Yep. Square groupers.
Apparently, I don't remember, but when I was a kid, my grandparents' condo, a square grouper washed up. And my parents and all the construction men were climbing down and running to the beach and just filling up hard hats and T-shirts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but you'd have guys in the Keys with new trucks. The old, the guides, and they used to run the shorelines, especially if they heard that a mothership had gotten busted and they tried to throw stuff over or whatever. But they'd run the whole shore and down Biscayne and up and down the Keys looking.
Speaking of square grouper, if we stop there to eat, any menu recommendations?
Oh, I love their Thai bowls. but they're fresh. They're so good. I love the square grouper. She does a great job, and just their food's great. Just go early because it's like one of the only places up in that neck of the woods to eat, and it's the best place. So it gets crowded. Okay. She has she's got a tapas bar upstairs or something that's opened up though. So so it's really good though. But yeah, that, and I'll tell you the other place, the Cafe Soleil down in Key West is wonderful. The new what is it? The Thirsty Shrimp. What else? I love Louis' Backyard just for ambiance. If you want to go for a drink and watch the sunset and all that good stuff, Louis is great.
Where am I going to find the best sandwich down there?
Boy, that's a good question. There's a deli on Stock Island. What's it called? Next to Rosoco's or God, I forget the name of the little deli. That's a tough one. I'm up in Sugarloaf, so food is deli stuff and everything. Baby's Coffee has some wraps and stuff, but I'm I try to stay out of it's almost like the Hamptons the traffic going into Key West, at least for me, if I want to take the boat and go further south in the morning, is not so fun, so that's the downside of where I live, is that you're sort of in between things. Key West is great. It's easy to stay out of the fray, but you got to go there shopping, and you got to go, when you need stuff.
What's your most played album?
My most played album?
Imagine some time in the car. You've got some records to spin.
I love the Eagles. I sort of grew up with them in California. The Eagles are great. It's just Elton John. It's a lot of the classic stuff that you love. There's, I would say I love Dire Straits. Mark Knopfler, I think they're all just. Especially, if I could think of one thing, every time I hear it, if I was going to relate an album to fly fishing, it would be Madman Across the Water. And the reason being is that when I went to Idaho, I worked at the boathouse on this lodge, and it was sat right on Henry's Lake. And I can remember many mornings getting the boat and having that blaring, Madman Across the Water as I'm staring across at the Tetons across Henry's Lake. And so as far as fly fishing, that would be the album that sort of reminds me of how it all started and what the journey's been.
Very cool. Left or right hand retrieve?
That's great. I much to Lefty's chagrin, I am a left-hand retrieve. And here's the reason. I used to get in this argument with Lefty all the time, and he used to say, Paul, you got to use your most dominant hand. And I said, Lefty, the problem is my dominant hand is my dominant arm, which is the strongest. So if I'm going to be pulling on a fish real hard, and I said, and Lefty, after you and Ted Jurassic expounded on the attributes of a large arbor reel, I would think that I don't have to worry about being the fastest, because of the large arbor. But I'm a left-hand retriever. I do both, but it's fighting the fish. I feel more control with my right hand fighting the fish. I don't worry about reeling, So I don't want to switch hands after I've cast. I'm stripping. I'm going to do, you know what I'm saying? So I'm going to cast with my right. I'm going to, tip down, strip. I'm going to hook them with the right hand. I'm going to reel with the left because I can fight harder with my right hand and right arm.
Nice. Who's your favorite James Bond?
Well, I have to say this. Okay, so Roger Moore. And the reason being is that the way that I met my wife in London, I was actually there with a bank. I was 30 years old, and I met the guy that was the lawyer for Cubby Broccoli. And Cubby Broccoli was the producer of all the James Bond films. And so we became, his name was Abba Schwartz, and he was the lawyer for Cubby, and we became friends, and he invited me to the premiere of Octopussy. And the one condition was that I take this girl that he had promised her father he would look over her, and that ended up being my wife. And we went to the premiere of Octopussy, which is like going to the Academy Awards in London. And that's how I met her, was on a blind date with Roger Moore, and Abba Schwartz was in the movie with Roger. We met Roger Moore, and that was the evening. Prince Charles was there. That's actually what we went over for, was that it was an event for Prince Charles and Diane.
Maybe that'll be on the next season of The Crown.
Yeah. Prince Charles' favorite charity at the time was it was called United World College, and he was trying to put Palestinian kids together with Jewish kids in a school so that they would learn to, be with each other. And that's why I went there. I was single and 30 years old, and I was invited by the bank that I did business with. And so, and that's how I met my wife. It was at the premiere of Octopussy.
That's remarkable, and I don't think I can ask any more questions. Where can people find you in the Keys and on Montauk and online, social media, website?
The flyfishingmontauk.com is my site, and, Captain Paul Dixon at mac.com.
Fantastic. All right, Paul, well, thank you so much, and I will be sending you an email with some Keys questions.
Great. All right, Rob. We
Fantastic.
Look forward to seeing you if you make it down here, dude.
Yeah. When do you head back up north?
I am up there this year. I got a mothership after I leave here, so I'll be back there June 1st.
All right, maybe we'll buy you a couple rounds in the Keys.
That sounds like a plan, man.
All right. We're driving, so I can bring the booze with me.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. For more information or to contact Rob, please go to www.robsnowhite.com. This podcast is brought to you by Freestone Productions at freestoneproductions.com.